Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the soundbite. Ben Kinsley is joining me as co-host. Welcome, Ben.
Hello.
Hello, hello. And our special guest tonight is Doug Hoffer, who is our Vermont State Auditor. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pat. Ben?
Yes,
Ben?
I think you've been on at least once before over the years. But you have been very busy these days, and congratulations, by the way, on your successful reelection. You've been in office since January 2013, which is a few years back. So good, that's great.
Yep.
That's good. Must be doing something right. But if you don't mind, I'd love to jump right in to start talking about all the issues that we've got on the plate tonight. I heard you. I've been covering a lot of the committee meetings for Campaign for Vermont, and I heard you talk to House Commerce and Economic Development Committee last week, and I was surprised by the conversation because they were talking about TIF districts, and you voiced some serious concerns about them, and apparently this was not news to them because I've read other things going back a ways about your thoughts on TIF district, and you especially said, and this is what I'd like to talk about, is that TIFs create a cost shift to poorer towns, and it's hard to tell what the true impact is on economic development. Could you spend just a second, though, talking about what a TIF district is for people who are viewing, and then maybe go into your concerns?
Sure, it's a little complicated, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can. Basically, what a town says under the statute is they go to their voters and they say, we'd like to make some investments in infrastructure, whether it's wastewater treatment, sidewalks, streets, whatever it may be, because we think that kind of investment is going to attract additional activity in town in a defined area, a certain number of parcels, and that will increase our property tax revenues for the town. And so at the beginning of the process, if it's approved by VEPC and if the voters approve it as well, they borrow money. Just pick a number, they borrow $20 million. And we know what the value of those properties in the defined district are on day one. So in the second, third, and fourth, and fifth year and on out, as that property value increases in that district, there's an increment of tax revenue that's new. Whatever the value of that property was originally, all that tax revenue is frozen. The town and the ed fund continue to get those monies. But we're talking now about the increment above that amount, if the town is successful in getting additional development. That increment is what's at issue. And the town gets to keep about 80%, well, it varies, between 70 and 80% of the money that would have gone to the education fund, so they can repay the debt that they incurred to make the investments. So it sounds terrible. And by the way, the impact is not on poorer towns. That's the point. And by the way, I'm not the only one that has a concern about this. The Joint Fiscal Office did a wonderful report about 3 years ago, basically saying the same conclusions I did. In any case, it's now up to at least $5 or $6 million a year that are effectively being diverted from the education fund so that the towns can repay their debt on this infrastructure. The fundamental question is, how much of that activity would have occurred without the TIF? And furthermore, if you go back a ways, I mean, you and I have been around for a while, Pat, in the old days, if a town was interested in upgrading its infrastructure for any reason, I'm in Burlington, and we used to, they came to us all the time. We want more money for housing, parks, wastewater, whatever it might be. And the mayor would come to the town and to the voters and say, will you approve an increase in your taxes to pay for this investment? And we'd say yay or nay. But after Act 60, we had this statewide property tax. So decisions about local taxes also included or impacted the ed fund. So it's a very different world now. So basically, if you're a town manager or a mayor of a town and you want to use this TIF program, you get to go to your voters and say, have I got a deal for you? We can get this infrastructure built and it's not going to cost you a dime.
Right.
Which sounds great if you're a town manager, but somebody's got to pay. And what it is all the people who live in the towns who aren't in your town. So I have a concern about that. And in fact, I wasn't opining in the committee about TIF generally, but about a proposal that was advanced last year and was sidetracked because of COVID, about what they call project-based TIF. It's sort of mini.
Right.
And
Right.
they basically said, well, we have small towns who would like to do a small-ish investment in infrastructure for a handful of properties, which we think will grow or add jobs or whatever the case may be. And my response is, if it's that small, how come your voters don't support it? And
Ah,
JFO did a memo on this and ran some numbers that I was interested in. And they said, because they capped this at 1.5 million. You
right.
can't do much infrastructure for $1.5 million. But assume that's the number for a moment. And it's not even 1.5 because that's got to include the interest. So it's about 1.2. If you run that number through a model and say, well, what would that mean for you if you owned a median priced home in town worth $250,000? It would mean your taxes would go up about $5 a month. So for all of that, we're saying, use the TIF model. I don't buy it. And there are members of the legislature who are kind of scratching their head. I don't know whether it's going to get through the House,
Yeah.
about in the Senate as well. It's got to go from Commerce to Ways and Means and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, it's in law. So it's not going away. They're talking about a new version of the program that's smaller. So we'll see.
Right. I actually listened to their testimony today in Senate Economic Development, and they're passing out the bill tomorrow morning. And they call it a mini TIF. And I think they've increased a couple of the dollars you mentioned. So they're hoping to have some of it fixed in finance, but it's on its way, be on its way tomorrow.
Well, I don't know if the House is going to support it, to be very honest, but we'll see.
Oh, really? Yeah, because it's interesting. I also read where you were talking about it's hard to determine a return on investment, mainly because they use the but for. I don't know how many people know that, but what the towns ask you for when you're presenting to them about a project is, but for this program, this project wouldn't happen. So how does the return on investment fit into that? I wasn't quite sure.
It's impossible to measure. That doesn't mean that there is no return. It means in the case of any given town, we don't know. And the Joint Fiscal Office said the same thing. Now, in fairness, I don't think there's any question that there are some small-ish towns. I mean, you're not going to see TIF in towns that have 400 people, but
Right.
mid-sized Vermont towns where they want to protect and enhance the sustainability of their downtowns, such as they are, it's not inappropriate for the state to look for ways to help those towns. My concern is that this may not be the most efficient way to do that, and there are others who feel the same way. Why not just make it part of the capital bill? It's transparent, because this is not transparent. Right? Regular folks don't know what this means. And whenever shifting a tax burden and it's not transparent, people have some questions about when the bill comes due, what just happened?
Right.
Nobody knows what TIF means. Come on.
Right.
Honestly. And it requires VEPSI to do a lot of work. It requires us. Frankly, this kind of came out of nowhere. But a few years ago, the legislature instructed us, without asking me, instructed the Office of the State Auditor to conduct an audit of every TIF town times in its life cycle. There are now, I think, 8 TIF towns. So the schedule reads that my office will be doing TIF audits for the next 30 years.
Wow.
I've come to believe that if anybody's going to do it, it should be my office because we're truly independent. But every TIF audit we do means we're not doing an audit about something else. There's an opportunity cost to this. So last year we went to the Appropriations Committee in the House and said, look, you guys, I laughed. I said, this is my first unfunded mandate. You didn't give us any more resources. And they said, you're right. So they gave us another position, which we haven't been able to fill yet because of the pandemic. But anyway, it's a big deal. It costs money, it costs time. And like I say, in the old days, the mayor would just go to the voters and say, here's my story. Does it make sense to you? I don't know why we don't do that now. Anyway,
well, especially when people hear it won't cost you any money. That'll perk them up.
Well, and last thing before we move on, by the way, the legislature's economist made a very good point about this. He weighed in a few years ago as well and said, look, and he's a guy who has a lot of experience in real estate. He's the guy who works with Jeff Carr and does the revenue for the state. Tom. And he said, I'm pretty sure that almost all of the development that the towns are trying to attract into the downtown area would occur. Businesses aren't stupid. They don't invest money unless they believe they can get a return on their investment. The question is, would they put that hotel out by the interstate exit or downtown? That's really the question for them, where as opposed to whether to do it or not.
Hmm.
I'm all for protecting, as I said before, the downtowns. The question is TIF the best vehicle for that? That's all.
Are you
That's a good
suggesting
question.
another way to do that, Doug? What would you suggest they do? Flat out bonding?
I would have the state devote some of their capital funds to a revolving fund for the towns.
Interesting.
So the way I think about, well, I'll get to that in a second, I guess. In your audits, have you found any situation where towns are underwater on their TIF districts, meaning that they didn't recoup the investment that they thought they would?
As a matter of fact, there is one, and it caused a lot of grief. St. Albans is still has not had sufficient increase. The increment that we were talking about before is not sufficient yet to meet their debt service. I'm sure it will be at some point, but it hasn't been. So what St. Albans did is literally used bond proceeds. They borrowed, pick a number, they borrowed 20 million bucks. They couldn't make the debt service payments in the first few years, so they used the money they borrowed to pay off the money they borrowed.
Wow.
That is explicitly prohibited by statute. We got an opinion from the Attorney General's office, and they said, we don't agree. So they went to VEPSI and said, what do you think? VEPSI has the authority to make decisions about things like this. And we said, well, VEPSI, here's the decision by the Attorney General. And they said, that's nice, we'll make our own decision. They completely blew off the opinion by the Attorney General and relied on an opinion at the Agency of Commerce. I gotta tell you, I didn't care for that. If you can't rely on an opinion from the Attorney General's office, then we're in murky water.
Yeah.
But
I agree.
To my knowledge, only one town has had that problem.
Okay. But only 8 towns have taken advantage of it at this point.
Yeah.
I'm curious what the legislature, and I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but I'm curious what the legislature is targeting with projects that would be capped at $1.5 million. Like what is that even?
Well, it didn't start that way. Last year, I think they came in without a cap. And some of the subsequent committees, including Senate Appropriations, I believe, last year said, we're aware that this is creating a bit of a problem for the ed fund. So, we're interested in letting you try a new program, a reduced version of TIF, but we don't want it to be as much money as the other ones. They're the ones that put in the cap. The original proposal from the administration didn't include that. Not to
Gotcha.
And now ignoring the cap and going back to, full blown.
Just so you know, they moved the cap up to 5 million, Doug, and they put the length of 5 years and 15 projects. So it's going out of committee like that. Sorry to bring the news to you, but they upped it to 5 million per project. Great, right?
One thing I could see, and this is, and again, TIFs may not be the right mechanism for this, but one thing I can see, this being useful for is if you want to, like refurbish a parking lot in a public park, for example, like you got a park that has a bunch of potholes in it, and you think that you can generate more revenue, or maybe it's a hiking trail that's maintained by the town. And you think you can generate more revenue if you fix up, put in a new parking lot, expand the parking lot, whatever. I could see that, but then the problem is you don't have a tax-bearing parcel connected to it, which is where TIF becomes a problem.
Well, no, you could argue that the properties that border the park arguably would become more valuable if the park was improved. That's the theory. If you increase the size of the parking lot, then you can have more development because you can have more cars. Not that I care for cars. I would like to move away from cars, but nevertheless, it's about capacity and amenities, right? And it makes perfect sense. However, I'm not keen on shifting that burden to other towns, frankly.
Right. Because basically what you're asking with the TIF, the function of how it works is you're shifting the debt service more or less onto the ed fund, which is then distributed across all, 259 other towns.
If they have their way, I believe the Agency of Commerce will address that question by giving TIF authority to every town in the state.
To make it equitable, everyone has access to it.
This is great.
Fabulous, which makes the whole ed fund even bigger. In any case.
Yeah. So anyway, let's move on. Ben, do you have a question on the EB5?
Yeah, so I was gonna, I wanted to ask, obviously EB5 was a huge issue that you guys were involved in a couple of years ago. It's kind of fallen out of the headlines at this point in time. Where are we with that? JPEAK is still in receiver. JPEAK and Burke are both still in receivership. They were profitable last year. Well, 2019 they were profitable. 2020 probably not so much. But where do we stand with that?
I think the receiver is actively trying to sell JP.
Oh.
And I have no doubt that he will. Almost all of the investors have been repaid. There's one group, I think the Burke crew has not been repaid, but otherwise everyone has been repaid. There are some people that got caught in the wash and they couldn't get their green cards. That's a whole separate problem. But on balance, the receiver, as far as I know, has done a very good job. For us, what happened is the Attorney General, as you may recall now, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, did reach an agreement with Kiros for a settlement of some of the concerns the state had with him directly. And once he was done with that, that was early, that was before the criminal case with the U.S. Attorney, before some of these civil suits that are still active. And he said, okay, my job is done. I can't do the equivalent of an audit because I represent the people who are at issue from the Agency of Commerce and the governor's office and the previous employees and so forth. So I want to turn it over to the state auditor who can do that. And I said, oh, thanks.
Gee, swell.
Yeah.
Nothing to do.
On the other hand, people understandably want the question answered. You know, what responsibility, if any, did state employees and prior folks have for this thing? And that's a fair question. However, there are several ongoing cases, and the people involved, some have been taken out. I think the Supreme Court said that one of the cases could proceed, but some of the people are no longer defendants. But there's another case that an attorney has, private attorney, where they are still involved. So to the extent that some of those former officials, Pat Moulton, Lawrence Miller, you know, the people who were the head of the agency, the governor's office and so forth,
Right.
they're people that we need to interview. We have already reviewed all of the materials related to EB5. Every document that's there, we've reviewed it. But we can't go to the next level, which is the only thing left, which is interviewing those people, because their lawyers, including the Attorney General, would say, don't do that. And here's why. If it was just a state court, I'm almost certain that a state judge, if asked, say by this attorney, Russell Barr, who's handling the case for some aggrieved investors, most of whom have been repaid, the statute says that work papers, including interviews with people that we develop in the course of an audit, are not subject to the Public Records Act until the work is done. Now, having said that, if something's confidential, it's confidential forever. But normal stuff, like interviews with these folks, you know, we could release it after the fact, but not until the audit's done. And there are a lot of reasons for that, and that's true all over the country for the most part. So they have advice from their attorneys, don't go be interviewed by the auditor, and here's the reason. A federal judge, and they're involved now, because the U.S. Attorney's Office brought criminal charges against Kiros Stenger. A federal judge could easily say, I don't care about state law. If the state auditor has interview tapes with these people, I want them.
Wow.
And I would have to turn them over. And it's well understood in audit land that you don't interfere with litigation.
Mm-hmm.
So as much as people are anxious for an answer to these questions, and I am too, and we are, you know, we don't have that much work left to do. It's basically the interviews and then cobbing it all together. And we've already given you what would be the background, introduction, and all that stuff in the audit we released. So that's the deal. And I promised TJ, part of the deal was I wanted access to everything, including attorney-client privilege materials, which arguably I think the statute gives us a right to. But when I'm talking to the Attorney General, he's not comfortable with that. So I said, you
I wonder why.
That my office will not release anything until all the litigation is complete. And of course, I will not and would never make public attorney-client privilege material. But in order to tell and to understand the story,
Right.
all need that. And Anyway, that's the story. So we'll get there, but we're not there yet. And by the way, you're not hearing a lot, but remember, Quiros pled guilty.
Yeah.
I believe it's negotiating something with the U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney is leaving, and there's a new one coming, and so just when you think you're getting close, it pushes out another 6 months or a year.
Yeah,
I
that was
experienced-
probably the most probably underreported headline in the last year was Quiros pleading guilty. Somehow, that got buried along with everything else.
yeah, I think Bill Stenger saw it though, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I bet he did.
Yeah, definitely.
But just for the record, Doug, we do have successful EB5 projects here. I know Sugarbush had a very successful one. I talked to them off and on over the years about it, and he just said that it was the right size and it was easy to manage and successful. I think
had a deal as well.
the who?
Mount Snow.
Oh yes, right. Yep. Yeah, it seemed to work perfectly for them.
Yeah, well, it works if you don't defraud people of their money.
You think?
So that little bit of
Yeah, right, exactly. So moving on to another, we're going to keep you very busy tonight, Doug.
Right.
You've made some comments about our public safety system structure and stuff, and you said that this strategically was a very good time to stop and take a look at public safety and what changes should or could be made. Could you comment more on that? We've covered this on the show before.
Yeah, a few weeks or maybe a couple of months back, there were some proposals about making changes to various aspects of the public safety system, but they were all discrete. They were not part of a large, comprehensive, strategic plan. So you may recall, I think you do, that now 4 years ago, I got curious about spending on public safety. So I asked,
remember.
Yeah, to look at the data, both state and local. And I was shocked to learn that in 1 year, I think it was FY17, state and local governments in Vermont spent $574 million on public safety in a state with 630,000 people. I was shocked by that. Now, I have no history or experience in public safety, not with the police, not with the state police, judiciary, and so forth, but it just seemed a lot. And I asked Senator Sears, who, as you know, has been focused on those issues for a long time. I said, Dick, if you had a chance with a blank slate to design the public safety system today, would it look anything like what we have now? And he just laughed.
Yeah, right.
It has evolved over decades, all no doubt for reasons that people at the time felt were justified. But now it's a bit of a mishmash, and you have a lot of different pieces and parts that aren't responsible to each other. I think I'm not the only one that would say there's likely redundancies in the system, and I have no doubt that we could save money. Having said that, it's not something I've spent a lot of time investigating other than the dollar amount. So all I said, I thought there was a moment when they were talking about changes to the system. I said, this is the time to step back. Don't do little pieces. That's what we did for 75 years.
Right.
Do a big picture look. So, needless to say, they didn't do that. So that's all right.
Well, I hope they listen, because the men and women who work in public safety deserve to work in a well-organized structure and be respected. So,
what were those numbers again?
What
were those numbers again? Yeah.
$574 million in 1 year.
Wow.
So that's almost $574 million in 1 year. That's almost like what? That's $800,000 per person.
It's almost $1,000.
Almost $1,000 per person. Okay.
And that may not sound like a lot, but to say it's per person means a family of four, $4,000.
Right. Yeah. No. Seriously.
About this, related to something that's also in House Commerce, because they're talking again about tourism and marketing. And the department always puts out a report every couple of years, a so-called benchmark study, that all states do this to remind legislators about how great tourism is. And don't misunderstand, the term of art is we export a lot of taxes because people come here and spend money and pay taxes, and that's all good. But those analyses never include the costs of tourism. One of
Right.
which, aside from the obvious, roads and bridges, because of all the people driving here, is public safety. When you have smallish towns that, their population triples during big tourist season, you need more police presence, you need more fire, you need all that stuff. So those analyses should include the quantification of those costs as well. And furthermore, sadly, many of the jobs in the tourist industry are low paying, very low paying. A lot of those folks are recipients of one kind of public assistance or another. That could be quantified as well. But anyway, I just want to mention that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Interesting.
There are also the folks that are hardest hit from the pandemic, unfortunately. Like 50% of people in hospitality are out of a job right now.
Yeah, and I may say most of them are women. They had a discussion about that in one of the Senate committees today, and several of the legislators wanted to know just what you said, Doug. How do you quantify it? Where do you get the return on investment for the dollars that you spend? And it was quite the discussion today.
Good.
So anyway,
Look for the video. Is that in the House or the Senate?
I was in the Senate. I can send it. I think it was Senate GovOps.
Okay.
But I'll double check and send it to you.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a discussion we need to have.
Yeah.
Like what really is the ROI and the costs associated with it? I mean, it's a huge industry, probably the largest industry outside of manufacturing in the state.
Yeah. They wanted to set up a travel tourism fund that would glean money from excess revenue, which I don't know quite what that means, but
Excess meals and
I can
tax.
explain it to you.
Yeah.
They've been looking to get this done for 5 years. And
well, I don't think they're going to do it this year either.
they're not. It's laughable. It's
Because there's a lot of committee members weren't happy with that discussion. So I'll send it to you.
to you real quick. I know the story. What tourism and marketing wants is a percentage of the annual increase in the meals and rooms tax if it goes
Right.
up.
Right.
When I first proposed this, I think 5 years ago, I saw it and I said, this looks weird. They cherry picked a few years to say, see how much the revenues are going up and so forth. And I said, I think the cherry picked. So I looked at 10 years and then I talked to Tom Cavett and JFO asked him to write a memo. Well, the fact is meals and rooms tax revenues were going up consistently while the budget for tourism and marketing was going down.
I'm down.
There's zero correlation between the two.
Interesting.
And it's just silly. Now, here's an important point. The tourist industry is populated by lots of businesses, large and small. The big ones, understandably, spend a lot of money on advertising and marketing. They have to. That's their business. And according to the economic census, they spend between $80 and $100 million a year. Just for marketing purposes. So if the state is spending $3 million, there is no methodology available to tell you the impact of that $3 million in the context of $100 million. It's impossible. No, there is no such methodology, and there never will be. So if somebody says we need to spend more on tourism because it'll help, how do I know it's going to help? How can you tell me it's going to help? Where is the evidence? None.
Well, you would like the discussion they had today then, because they were ACCD was being challenged a little bit, pushback on. So
I've been part of that.
oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm all for sensible economic development.
Right.
But a lot of our legacy programs don't make a lot of sense, and that's one of them. But sorry.
I read today that there's one state, and I think it's Washington, that doesn't have any money, state money in travel and tourism. They rely on, as you just said, the big corporations to spread the word. And they do pretty well.
Yeah.
But there you go.
Doug, something that you were involved in recently was suing One Care Vermont, which is our accountable care organization in the state, which basically is an umbrella for a large number of our hospitals for payment distribution. But you were looking for payroll information, trying to understand how they can justify their payroll expenses. They have this large $16 million overhead, and we're not really sure what we're getting for that. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. A couple of things. First of all, the $16 million was what they spent. Last year, before COVID, their budget request to the board, the Green Mountain Care Board, was 20.
Wow.
And that had doubled in 3 years. So we have, the numbers show tremendous growth. And they would say we're expanding because our attributable lives, as they call them, keep expanding, which the model expects. Although Medicare or CMS is on their case because they haven't grown at the rate they should have. But I didn't wake up one day and say, gosh, wouldn't it be fun to sue OCD? I asked them repeatedly for this information, well, I can tell you why I did it in a minute, but the contract between the Department of Vermont Health Access, DVA, and OneCare Vermont has a provision that could not be more clear. There is no ambiguity in it whatsoever. It says an agent of the state can request information, accounting information, and if they do, you shall provide it. It doesn't say you can if you feel like it. Right? It says you shall, period. Black and white, black letter law, as they say. And I said, hey guys, I'm looking for this information. Can you provide it? And they said, no, we're not going to do that. So I went to the CEO and I said, I made this request, and they said no. And she said, no.
Jeez.
We don't have the right to this. I said, but the contract says. I went to law school. I must have missed that class in contract law where it said you only have to abide by the elements of the contract that you feel like.
Right.
You sign a contract, you sign the whole contract. In any case, the bottom line is a couple of things. That we did an audit of related issues last year. We're doing another one right now on the same related subjects. The model is, I don't know whether you know this, but the model is all of the players, Medicare, Medicaid, and Blue Cross, get together with OneCare and the others and say, we think that next year we can keep people healthy for, pick a number, $1 billion. If they come in below that number, then the hospitals and the other providers get to share some of the savings. If they come in over, they have to pony up some extra money. So it's a matter of shared savings or losses. Interestingly, the calculation about that number does not include OneCare Vermont's admin costs.
Oh, interesting.
We called out the Green Mountain Care Board about that, and it's not their responsibility only because it's in the contract with CMS. It's weird. So that's one thing. Second, the contract, OneCare Vermont does not provide healthcare services, right? They do a lot of things. They're sort of the middle person, but they are expected to perform some tasks related to the larger process. And each of those tasks are conducted, for the most part, by their staff, often in concert with partners. So if my office wants to review the effectiveness and efficiency of that work, I need to know how much they're paying their staff to do those particular tasks. And if they don't give me that data, I can't answer the question. So we expect to get a response from them in response to our complaint within about a week and a half.
So
anyway, that's what that's about.
So we'll give Pat a second here, but
you asked a question about price transparency in healthcare, and specifically about the charge data, right?
Yeah, so that was interesting because that was something else that was kind of happening around the same time as you were looking at this OneCare issue. CMS had changed some of their rules and now require hospitals to publish their charge master data, which all 13 hospitals in Vermont did in January. Is that something you guys have looked at all? I'm curious.
Actually, we've done 2 reports on this already on healthcare price transparency. One in, I think, 14 and one in 16. And what's interesting, the hospitals would have you believe that that charge master data is valuable. It's not. The only people who pay those rates are people without insurance. Mm-hmm. Because what Blue Cross and MVP and the others do is negotiate prices with the providers, almost entirely with hospitals, of course. But they're not anything like the charge master rates. So that's a bit of a dodge. It's not a bad thing that they publish them. That's okay. And in fact, I'll give you an example why it's a good thing. And we looked at this. Take a common procedure, unfortunately common, like a knee replacement. Not for a young guy like you, but for old folks like me. The variance in the cost of that procedure at the hospitals around Vermont is enormous. Now, you can imagine slight differences here and there, but thousands and thousands of dollars. A lot.
Yeah.
And who knows why, right? But that's true for all of the major procedures performed, elective surgery anyway. And we've got data on that, and it shows up in the charge data, but we also have data from the state because we're self-insured and we looked into that. So this is a big deal. The Green Mountain Care Board was given way too much to do when they were created, right? Do you want to take care of this video thing, or do you want to keep going?
We can keep going. And I'll see if we can get Pat back here.
Okay. So the price transparency thing is so important that the legislature told the board that it was part of their portfolio of things they wanted them to address. And to be honest, they have not done so at all. And what happened a few years ago is former Senate Pro Tem Tim Ash, who was on the Finance Committee at the time, took an interest in this and got his colleagues to agree to require Blue Cross and MVP on their own websites for their subscribers to make information available about what procedures cost at different hospitals and get some information about, how many of those knee replacements has this doctor done? Stuff like that. Very important. And they've made a little bit of progress, but there's much more to be done.
And I remember one of those reports that you did said something along the lines of, it's not just enough to look at prices. You also have to compare quality metrics, and so you get a value, right? Because price by itself doesn't tell you anything other than how much it's going to cost. Doesn't tell you that, I may have to go get this surgery redone in 2 years because the doctor doesn't know what they're doing.
And further, we live in a culture that assumes that the highest priced product is the best.
Right.
Mercedes is a lot better than a Datsun, so they assume, well, and furthermore, the people with good insurance have almost no incentive to find the best price. Because if you have a very low deductible, it doesn't matter if the knee replacement costs $8,000 as opposed to $28,000.
Right.
You're going to pay your deductible, period.
That's true too, because and this is trying to think of all right. So if you have like a surgery, let's say the surgery costs $30,000 at one place, $20,000 at a different place. That's great if that's what your sticker price is, but that's not necessarily the price that people are paying, right?
Right.
Because one hospital, the hospital that's charging $20,000 could be out of network, and the hospital that charges $30,000 is in network, and all of a sudden, you're only paying $1,000 deductible for the $30,000 surgery, whereas if you were out of network at the $20,000 one, you could be paying God knows what.
Yeah, I mean, this is an example of why this is so maddening. This is the only aspect of life in America today where you have no choice about these things. There are some medical procedures that you can't say, I'm not going to do that, right? Your quality of life gets so bad that you have to do it. But you have no idea what it's actually going to cost you going in. None. Now, that's an outrage to me.
Yeah.
And the fact that this industry has been able to resist the need for this kind of information says everything about power. That's what a lot of these things are about, power. So.
Well, yeah, and I mean, in that example too, right? The because hospitals know that people are going to make purchasing decisions not necessarily off what the sticker price is or what the charge master says or whatever. They're going to be making decisions off of what their out-of-pocket costs are.
Right.
So that's where they go to negotiate with with the larger insurance providers to say, hey, let's make the out-of-pocket costs on these really lucrative surgeries or procedures, let's make that out-of-pocket cost low, but the problem with that is then it costs the entire system as a whole more, because then the insurance companies have to charge more for their service and all of that.
Yeah, no, the system's not working at all.
No,
except for the care. I mean, the doctors and nurses,
yeah,
we all love it. But as a business, it's not working for us.
No. Yeah, and it's laughable to me that a lot of these hospitals can style themselves as nonprofits. Like
Well, we
I think
did
that's just
that to them,
laughable.
right?
Yeah.
Didn't we make them nonprofits in statute?
We
I
made
know
the
Blue
designated-
Cross.
We made the designated agencies nonprofit.
Yeah, right.
That's only $300 million a year.
It doesn't make sense to me.
No.
There you go.
It's crazy. Another issue that you've and we kind of talked about this a little bit.
Yeah,
This
I
is
think
kind of
so.
related to the TIF districts, but you've looked at other economic development programs like VEPC, which is the Vermont Economic Progress Council, and some of the other like VITA loans and things like that, and kind of similar concerns about those that you have as with TIF districts, which is the but-for issues as well as the return on investment. How do you determine return on investment for some of these types of projects?
I'm so glad you asked. I released 2 reports last year that got virtually no coverage. Can't imagine why. There was nothing else going on last year, right? So one of them was in response to a story first aired in November of 19. And Global Foundries absorbed IBM. They had a number of different divisions. You know, everybody thinks of them as a manufacturer, and they are, although much reduced now from 20 years ago. But part of the company that Global Foundry took from IBM included this division of engineers who were responsible for hundreds of extremely valuable patents. And for some reason, Global Foundries decided that that wasn't part of their future with that company going forward. So they kind of made it a standalone subsidiary and dangled it out there in the business world and said, maybe somebody will buy it. So this company, I think based on the West Coast, but they're global, called Marvell Technologies, came along and said, we like that a lot. We'll buy it. And they offered $600 million in cash.
Wow. Ooh, ouch.
Unlike a manufacturing company, you can't, you know, if it's traditional IBM, you can pack up the machines and move them somewhere. And you can hire people to be trained to run those machines. But you can't train engineers to be smart like the guys who created the patents that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You want that team. There's no reason for you to break up that team or move that team, period. And I'm not persuaded, having read in the industry press, that this company, Marvell, had any intention of moving this firm. Zero. But what happened is some local economic development folks went to VEPC and said, boy, this thing's coming down the track. You better get on this or they might leave. There was no evidence whatsoever.
Right.
So they persuaded the company to apply for a VEGI award, the Employment Growth Incentive Award. Note the name, Employment Growth. The statute does not authorize awards for retention. And that's exactly what this was. But in the process, VEPC characterized it as a plant shutdown and restart. There was no plant shutdown. If a plant shuts down, then you start seeing ads a week later in the paper that says, God, we need to hire 200 people right away. No. In fact, in the press releases from Marvell, they were very clear, saying, look at this great team we just inherited and paid a lot of money for. The team, the guys who were responsible for the patents, right? They're going to pay off for decades to come. So VEPC, in my view, did something that they were not authorized by law to do. In the term of art in law is ultra vires, beyond their authority. So they just made up this thing. They said it was a plant shutdown. It wasn't. They gave them $5 million. Now, it's an outrage to me. And furthermore, what's interesting is if, like me, you believe that they exceeded their authority, and by the way, I'm not suggesting they don't have good intentions. All the people on the council want the same thing we all want. More and better jobs for Vermont and so forth. I think they're abusing the process. If, like me, you were concerned, you could say, well, God, how do I appeal that? Who do I go to? Well, interestingly, from the very beginning of this program in the late 90s, the predecessors to VEGI was called the EATI, same kind of program, tax credits, a little bit different. It said explicitly, decisions by VEPC cannot be reviewed administratively or judicially, period.
Wow. Speaking of accountability,
Yeah.
That means that those 9 people appointed by the governor, which is kind of an interesting issue, and 2 legislators, their decisions cannot be reviewed. Even the
wow,
legislature, if they were so inclined and said, what just happened here? Doesn't matter. I was
that
not.
is that is wrong. Sorry.
Is the intention of that so that there's no ambiguity for businesses if they've gotten an award, they don't have to worry about it being ripped away? Is that kind of the thought process behind that?
I'm certain that was part of it, and that's understandable. But what you could do is say a review must be, if somebody brings a review, it has to be complete within 30, 60 days, something like that. There are ways to deal with things like that. But to have a group of 11 appointed people, 9 appointed to elected, make billion-dollar decisions, multi-million-dollar decisions with zero accountability is undemocratic.
I mean, this is public dollars. This is our dollars, right?
VEPSI would have you believe that there's no cost to the state because, say it with me, but for this award, they would.
Yeah, I'm getting to hate that phrase.
In fact, you may recall that the day before the award was announced, they laid off 70 people.
I remember that, actually.
Oh,
yeah.
yes.
So anyway, thanks so much for asking.
Yes. Right.
We might have hit a sore subject there.
Yeah, exactly. I can see that. I want to change this conversation to one of my favorite things, which is workforce development. And I loved an article you wrote about marginally attached workers, discouraged workers, that the numbers we see really are not reflective of our the folks that are out there that could work. Could you talk about that? Because I think this is fascinating.
Yeah, and in fact, it's playing national. Janet Yellen and others are finally, I think, and appropriately talking about the fact that the traditional unemployment rate is misleading. And that's been that way for years. In fact, the phase 2 of the job gap study that I wrote in 1997, I talked about this issue, which is fascinating and appropriate for conversation. The unemployment rate is based on a survey, the current population survey, and it's a solid piece of work, Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics. But what they ask you is, do you have a job? If you say yes, you're employed, they move on. If you say no, they say, oh, have you looked for work in the last 4 weeks? And if you say no, technically, for that standard, you're not part of the labor force at all. But subsequent questions dig a little bit deeper, and they say, well, why didn't you look for work in the last 4 weeks? And you say, well, my car's broken, I can't fix it. I'm taking care of my mother who's ill. I can't get out into the workforce right now. I want to work, but I can't. I'm very highly skilled and educated, but where I live, my wife has a good job, but there are no jobs that suit me here. I've tried, they're just not within 2 hours drive. So there's a whole bunch of reasons. But these people that I'm referring to, the marginally attached, which is a terrible phrase, but sort of works, and discouraged workers, these are people who say when asked, I want to work, but for various reasons, it's not working for me. I can't make it happen. So when you look at these figures, regardless of whether, like before the pandemic, Vermont's always, for 30 years, our unemployment rate's been a little bit lower than the national average. Doesn't matter where you go. These measures from the Bureau of Labor Statistics are called from U1 to U6. And the one that is the standard one is U3 that we all hear. U6 is the one that includes everybody. And that's typically twice or almost twice what the traditional unemployment rate is. So when we say, oh my God, look at this, unemployment's only 4%. Well, you're ignoring the other 4% who really would like to work, but the system is just not working for them for any number of reasons. So I'm glad you asked. It's a very important question. Yeah. You know,
well, we're always talking about attracting businesses here to Vermont, but where's the labor force? And maybe our numbers are not reflective of our labor force.
Well, it's funny, you know, my good friend, Senator Michael Sirotkin, believes in this, you know, remote and new worker program thing, paying to come here, which I don't much care for. We don't talk about it. But the fact is, if you're going to spend money to buy people who are skilled and can take vacant positions that are available from various employers, why not use the money to better educate and train Vermonters?
Right. There's a concept.
Yeah.
Good job.
So that's an interesting thing because and this is an issue that Pat and I have talked about, and we've talked with some other folks about, which is it seems like we have a special moment in time where everyone around the country is realizing they can do their job from anywhere.
Right.
A lot of people are having that realization, to the point that companies like Facebook, Twitter, Shopify Microsoft have all said remote work is going to be a permanent feature in their workforce. And Salesforce even went as far as to say that their 5-day work week is dead. They're not going back. So I think that positions Vermont in an interesting place. How we capture that, because quality of life here is better than most cities. So, and we have all these outdoor recreational opportunities. But how do we position ourselves to take advantage of that?
I don't think it's complicated, to be very honest. First of all, let's acknowledge that we have winter. So a lot of people aren't going to want to come here, which is fine. But a lot of people have an image of Vermont, much of which is true, not all. But people want families. Now we're not talking about what Pat was referring to, excuse me, which is employers. It's just workers and their families. We know what they want. They want good quality of life, right? They want good education.
Right.
So if you were to go to the legislature tomorrow and wave a wand and say, all three parties and independents, we're going to get together and make a commitment to make our public schools the best in the country, and not by a little, but by a lot over the next generation. We're going to make a generational commitment. They'd be lining up at the border.
Right.
Now, we also got infrastructure, which for us is not so much roads and bridges, but broadband. Mm-hmm. And we have completely failed on broadband. Jim
for 20 years.
Got it 20 years ago. Where are we? We haven't gotten it done. We really missed the boat. So to answer your question, we do have good quality of life. We need to protect it and enhance it, and maybe spend a little less money on some of it. But we have to get the infrastructure right, and sooner rather than later. And I think we need to get education right. We've been talking for, well, Pat, you know better than I, for a quarter of a century or more about how much to spend for education and how to raise the money. That's a legitimate question that we should all engage in. Where's the conversation about quality?
Performance, right? Exactly.
I think it was interesting about it is we've by and large had the wrong conversation for 20 years on education. It's not how much money we spend it's where we spend it. And that is the problem, because where we are spending it is not necessarily getting better outcomes.
No, but I'm not sure the model we have is appropriate for the 21st century either. I think there's so much more conversation that's necessary about education that we spend all our time talking about money. That's all we talk about is money.
Right. Yeah, I read the article that you wrote on that, and when the catchphrase was, if we built up our education, they will come. And I thought that is just so on the money. That is so. I wish somebody was listening, because I think that is the key.
It's a lot harder than writing a check for $5,000, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, we are almost out of time. What other interesting things do you have going on? Any audits that are in the pipeline? Anything that our viewers should be aware of?
Yeah, we have some interesting projects, almost all of which are coming to completion within the next 6 or 8 weeks. One of them that actually is going out tomorrow for comment by the agency is related to education. It addresses the question of trends in the number of students and the dollars that follow them going in the tuitioning program to private schools.
Perfect.
Although people don't like to call them private, they're approved independent schools.
Right, exactly.
Use
You
the
don't
right
call them
terminology.
private.
Yeah.
Very. So that's one. Another, which we have completed the planning phase and are just about to start the field work, is related to the very large COVID economic recovery grant program that the Agency of Commerce undertook.
Right.
Tax Department had a big piece. we're going to start with the agency. And in addition to some mechanical stuff about whether they followed their own rules about eligibility and awarding to the right people, there's a very serious question about the agency's methodology for determining the need. And they decided to go with revenue loss. And a bunch of people said to them last year, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because if Pat was smart and had some flexibility as a business owner, when she saw what was happening with COVID, she was going to reduce her overhead to the extent possible. And that could include laying people off, because they had, some of them had access to, you could have gotten the PPP to help pay them. They could have gotten additional unemployment and so forth. So your overhead might have been $10,000 a week, but you managed to get it down to $6,000. But if all you look at is revenue,
Yep.
right? There's a difference between a P&L statement and revenue.
Right.
They went with revenue, which a lot of people told them was not optimal, but that's what they did. So we're looking into that, and I wouldn't be surprised if we find some money went to folks who really didn't need it. So that's another one. We're doing the same thing with the hospitals, who had a separate program. Some of the same issues came up with them, although I think the Agency of Human Services did a little bit more due diligence, because there were fewer of them. The agency had a huge pool of businesses, and part of their pitch was, if we do what you're asking us to do, it'll take too long. Well, sometimes when you do things quickly, you make mistakes. Those are two that we're working on. Also, we have another good healthcare project underway, which should be done in a month or so. I was interested, as a piggyback to this earlier conversation about how much OneCare's admin costs are, how much do taxpayers pay just to monitor and sue this system? And as it turns out, Medicaid through DEVA spends about $3 million a year of our money on OCD's, OneCare Vermont's admin. We pay for some of that. So we have every right to know how much and how much they're paying their own people.
And I think they've got about 60 employees, don't they, in OneCare, which staggers me a little bit. I'm not quite sure what they're all doing, but there they are.
Moving their desks around. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're working hard, but
no.
People who are concerned about whether this model, as currently,
is working.
Now, it may be that all we need to make it work better is a much tougher regulator.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and at some point, right, at some point, part of the goal of OneCare is to reduce costs and make costs more predictable, right? Control growth and spending, because you're saying, here's what we give you to keep this population healthy. So at some point, they've got to justify, at some point in the future, they've got to justify their existence on cost savings, or at least value, right? A value proposition. And that seems like a hard argument to make right now.
Well, they're not doing too well. They haven't done too well so far. And interestingly, they don't have enough data to honestly evaluate their progress, because they don't really have good quality data at all. But they are now beginning up to renewing the contract for another 5 years before they even have the data sufficient to answer the question, is it working?
Really? Yeah, where are we today?
Interesting. Right, interesting. So how are we doing on time, Ben? Should we?
I think that's about it for time, but thank you very much for joining us.
You were, as usual, absolutely wonderful. We really appreciate this conversation. We thank you. Thank you. Anyway, this is Pat McDonald. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.